Please take care of yourself.
Wish you all a very good evening, respected seniors and my dear colleagues. With your permission, I begin the presentation of today's topic titled Timing the Optimum Management of Cardiorenal Metabolic Risk in Patients with Type 2 Diabetes Mellitus. Perspective for early combination of SGLT2 inhibitor with metformin with a particular importance upon empagliflozin amongst the different SGLT2 inhibitors that we have in our conundrum. Now, at the very onset, any discussion pertaining to type 2 diabetes falls short of its intention unless we truly understand and express the huge global problem that is diabetes. Not only health wise, the direct cause as also the indirect healthcare cost arising out of the huge prevalence of diabetes mellitus is humongous to say the least. Data from 2017 IDF data, the world has 425 million adult diabetics, adults 20 and 79 years of age. So of course by 2019 now we have the 2019 IDF data published now, and the numbers are of course increasing. India had approximately 1 out of 6 such patients of diabetes. 2017 data, India had around 73.9 million diabetics. India approximately has around 77 million diabetics now. And even the global scenario is looking horrible. The poorest of the poor nations, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, these countries are expected to see a huge surge with urbanization in the next few decades. The world is expected to have around 629 million diabetics by the year 2045. In fact, this is projection from 2017 IDF, and the 2019 IDF does produce a even more grave projection, around 700 million diabetics throughout the world. Your diabetes, unfortunately, is undiagnosed in more than 50% of cases, and that goes true for India as well. Unfortunately, your diabetes never sleeps. So, no matter how well you control your patient with diabetes, no matter how wonderfully well compliant he is to your pharmacological and non pharmacological advice, no matter how well conversed you are with the different guidelines throughout the world, the diabetes is going to get worse. So, the insulin resistance is going to go up and ultimately plateau off. The total insulin levels are obviously going to come down. The fasting and the PP levels are obviously going to rise. The beta cell function is going to go down. The hepatic glucose production is going to go down, and both microvascular and macrovascular complications are going to progress. Please note on the diagram itself that your development of macrovascular complications in a patient of diabetes not only starts at the point of diagnosis of frank diabetes, something we define by a fasting value more than 126, a PP value more than 200, HbA1c more than 6.5%, or random sugar more than 200 along with symptoms of hyperglycemia, but well before that in the stage of prediabetes. Now, the impact and the understanding and the implication of the initiation of macrovascular complication even in the pre-diabetic stage is something that we will be discussing in the subsequent part of our slides. Current scenario of diabetes control in India, once again pretty horrible. If you consider there are 100 people with diabetes in India, only 15 patients out of those 100 have well controlled diabetes. 3 out of 100 would be such who have uncontrolled diabetes, but at least they are aware of the fact that they have uncontrolled diabetes. 32 patients would be such who have uncontrolled diabetes. Patients know that they have diabetes, but they are not aware of the fact that they have uncontrolled diabetes. So 15 plus 3 plus 32 is 50, and the remaining 50 out of 100 patients do not even know that they have diagnosis of diabetes. They are undiagnosed. So India has around 77 million diabetics now, in fact more than that, and 50%, more than 35 million diabetics in India do not even know that they have diabetes. So with this understanding, we will delve further into today's topic at hand. So obviously the comparison of patients with diabetes, how that compares, how that stacks up Indian patients against their Caucasian counterparts. When, say for example, when we compare patients from India and UK. Now, Indian patients are diagnosed at a young age, have less generalized obesity. Be very clear about the fact that the total obesity or the generalized obesity is lesser, but Indians tend to have, especially the Indian diabetics tend to have, or the Indian obese population tend to have thinner limbs but higher adiposity, and that adiposity is a higher central adiposity. More insulin resistance as well, measured by the HOMA IR. But one thing to comment regarding the HOMA IR, please note that the HOMA IR is a research tool. Sometimes we do find our colleagues practicing diabetes and diabetology rather to be advising HOMA IR. Please note that it's a research tool. It is not something to be used in clinical practice, especially in the management of diabetes mellitus. So advising insulin levels just for the sake of assessing HOMA IR makes no clinical sense. Yes, the newly diagnosed type 2 diabetes, India versus the UK, and the age at diagnosis. In the Indian cohort, diabetes is being diagnosed at almost a decade earlier. They tend to be slightly leaner. Say, for example, even when we are considering the risk factors, particularly even BMI, the Indian cutoff or the Southeast Asian cutoff would be 23 rather than 25 for diagnosis of overweight. In fact, the different subsets of diabetes, say for example, gestational diabetes, and when we are assessing the risk of gestational diabetes, even then the patients or the overweight patients whom we consider to be at a higher risk of gestational diabetes, the cutoff is 23 rather than 25. And yes, we can see that the waist hip ratio is higher in the Indian subpopulation as well. So the cardiometabolic risk factor control during times of crisis, and by crisis obviously we also include the terrible crisis that we are currently in, the COVID-19 pandemic. We are in the presently in the second wave as Indians, hopefully towards the fag end of the second wave, but we are gearing up for the possibly another horrible third wave. Unfortunately, we have lost many of our colleagues and many of our countrymen, and there seems to be no end to it, and we are now gearing up for the third wave. But yes, we are talking about such crisis situations and understanding what happens to the cardiometabolic risk factor in certain conditions. So the lifestyle control, financial constraints, particularly medical management as well, investigation as well, travel challenges, circadian disruptions, decreased visits to clinics and laboratories, and access to medicines, all of them contribute to the higher cardiometabolic risk in diabetic patients, yeah, and for that matter, cardiodiabetic patients, cardiometabolic patients in such scenario. And yes, the clock for the coronary heart disease starts ticking before the onset of clinical diabetes. This is something that we have just said, that the macrovascular complications not only begin at the time of diagnosis, it has already started in the pre-diabetes stage. So look at the left hand part of your slide. Non-diabetic throughout the study of the odds ratio for that is 1, or for that matter the relative risk for that is 1. Prior to the diagnosis of diabetes, already it is 2.82. So it is already 180% higher after diagnosis of diabetes. So at the diagnosis of diabetes, where already macrovascular complications have already started for years now, look at the relative risk. It is 3.71. If the diabetes was already present at baseline, relative risk is 5. So you can really understand how incredibly the risk of myocardial infarction or stroke. This is something what we called particularly 3P MACE in cardiovascular outcome trial of newer antidiabetic agents. So cardiovascular death, fatal, non-fatal MI, non-fatal stroke, how terribly the relative risk of both are increasing. Some issues pertaining to heart failure. Now, the heart failure per se at the diagnosis is not the only thing about concern. It's also patients who are at risk for heart failure, the stage A patients. So, patients at risk for heart failure but without current or prior symptoms or signs of heart failure and without structural biomarker or genetic markers of heart disease. So, who are the patients with the increased risk of heart failure? Patients with hypertension, cardiovascular disease, diabetes mellitus, obviously obesity, known exposure to cardiotoxins, family history of cardiomyopathy. The patient slips on into the pre-heart failure stage. These are patients without current or prior symptoms or signs of heart failure but evidence of at least one of the following, including but not limited to structural heart disease, abnormal cardiac function, and elevated natriuretic peptide, which might be diagnosed incidentally as well. And ultimately, the patient slips into the heart failure stage. These are patients with current or prior symptoms and signs of heart failure caused by structural or functional cardiac abnormality, heart failure in remission or persistent heart failure, and when the GDMT, that is the guidelines directed medical therapy, are inadequate. This is the patient of an advanced heart failure. Serious symptoms or signs of heart failure at rest, something that we call the NYHA stage 4, New York Heart Association stage 4. Symptoms are present at rest as well, and such patients would be requiring advanced therapies such as consideration for transplant, mechanical circulatory support, or palliative care. So, clinical priorities for a newly diagnosed patient with type 2 diabetes: the metabolic risk, of course, the blood sugar levels, the HbA1c level, the visceral adiposity, and this visceral or the central adiposity, which is higher in the Southeast Asian cohort, the Indian cohort as well, obviously a part of the Southeast Asian cohort, increased insulin resistance, higher risk of cardiovascular events, and not only that, the diabetes is occurring at 1 decade earlier. Premature death is a significant concern with cardiovascular disease as well. So, as is the norm, we will be discussing what we call an index case and try to understand the impact of early initiation of a combination of SGLT2 inhibitor and metformin in such a scenario, and how that would suit the cardiovascular implications of such a patient. So this is Mr. Praveen, a prototype newly diagnosed patient with type 2 diabetes. He's 52 years old, he's a non-smoker, but he has hypertension. So essentially the patient is already having some cardiovascular risk. Patient has a risk factor for heart failure. On probing, he has polyuria since 3 months. Look at the weight, it's 76, the BMI is 28. Of course, he's overweight, and considering the Indians, that is Indian, so obviously he is overweight. Look at the waist-arm components, it is more than 102. Blood pressure, patient is hypertensive. You can call it a pretty well-controlled hypertension. He's on telmisartan and amlodipine combination. Look at the HbA1c, it's 8.6, so definitely way beyond control. In a relatively young patient, he's 52 years old. For a diabetic patient, not a very old patient, HbA1c 8.6 is absolutely not acceptable in such a patient, particularly if there is no risk of hypoglycemia. Look at the fasting and the PP values, definitely not in control. And TIR. So TIR is a concept that we have discussed previously in different seminars. I have discussed previously in BI seminars as well. But we'll try to understand what this TIR is, although it is not a very important part of today's discussion. But considering the fact that we have moved on from the concept of diabetic triad of fasting, PP, and HbA1c, we have moved on into the what we call the diabetic hexad or the diabetic sixer, as we call it. So that would include the FPS, the PPBS, the HbA1c, and the markers of glycemic variability, how variable the blood sugar levels are. And the excellent marker for that would be the 24-hour continuous glucose monitoring, which gives you the TIR, that is the time in range. And the target TIR is at least 70%. So at least 70% of the time, the patient's blood sugar level should be within control, more the merrier. And of course, the other two components of the diabetic hexad would be the risk of hypoglycemia, that is overall hypoglycemia and the nocturnal hypoglycemia. These are the 6 factors contributing to form the diabetic hexad. It's a very important concept. Not only talks about the efficacy of diabetes treatment, also talks about the adverse effect profile of the anti-diabetic treatment. We're looking at our patient as well, and yes, look at the treadmill test. So this is suggestive of myocardial ischemia, something that we call the provocable ischemia. So he has provocable ischemia. He's definitely a patient at ASCVD risk. The beneficial metabolic effects of empagliflozin in patients with type 2 diabetes: decrease in visceral adiposity, decrease in insulin resistance, decrease in chronic inflammation, increase in the beta cell responsiveness, decrease in the hepatic fat, inflammation, fibrosis. All these factors we have discussed in the previous seminars. I mean, in this very platform with BI on BY Engage, we have discussed this. I have discussed this. Not really our target topic today, because this is an entirely holistic outcome of the metabolic effects of empagliflozin. But we will be highlighting the cardiac risk and the CKD risk with empagliflozin in our subsequent slides. The effects of oral glucose lowering therapies. This is something that we all know, I believe, everyone tuning into this. Just a short synopsis of the impact of the different common anti-diabetic medications that we use routinely. Empagliflozin, metformin as an initial combination therapy, and this is today's topic of discussion. Clearly, we will try to understand from a baseline, and look at the baseline. Look at the baseline. Baseline is on the higher side, 8.6, 8.69, 8.65. What are we treating? One arm received treatment published in Diabetes Care in 2016. One arm receiving treatment empagliflozin 5 plus metformin 500 BD, that is empagliflozin 10 and metformin 1000. Comparator arm metformin 1000, and on the other it's empagliflozin 10 plus metformin 2000 towards the day compared to metformin 2000. Outcomes are very clear cut. The difference in HbA1c reduction between the two is very significant. It is 0.79 and 0.33 respectively. Look at the confidence interval. The confidence interval does not include 0. So definitely statistically significant difference between the two arms. Look at the p-value. P-value is very significant in both the cases. Look at the numerical values. Patients achieving HbA1c less than 7% at 24 weeks, and these are all cases of early diabetes. Most of the cases were treatment naive cases. Look at that, 63% compared to 38%. If you are comparing the higher dose, 70% compared to 58%, both of them statistically significant. So this is what our patient was, Mr. Naveen, and yes, he seems to be a very good candidate for starting therapy with combination therapy. At progressive baseline HbA1c level, SGLT2 inhibition demonstrates a steeper decline in HbA1c compared to DPP4 inhibition. Baseline HbA1c from 8%, and obviously what we see is baseline 8%. The reduction in HbA1c is more when the baseline is higher. With the baseline HbA1c 9, the reduction is much higher. With the baseline HbA1c of 10, the reduction in HbA1c is much higher. But that is not our topic of discussion. Our topic of discussion is the last line. And for every, and it shows that for every 1% increase in baseline HbA1c, the corresponding HbA1c reduction at 24 weeks. For EMPA25, it is 0.49% with sitagliptin. It's a highly efficacious DPP4 inhibitor, and the first one to undergo cardiovascular outcome trial. And look at the very significant difference between the two. So significantly higher efficacy with empagliflozin compared to sitagliptin. There is a classic head-to-head trial, and this is the finding, where empagliflozin definitely scores over sitagliptin. It's a clear-cut head-to-head trial. Better patient-reported glycemic outcomes with empagliflozin versus glimepiride. And yes, so we want your patient to be in range, not above range, not below range. You do not want your patient to be having hyperglycemic episodes, and you definitely don't want your patients to be having hypoglycemic episodes. So this is empagliflozin versus glimepiride, study by Shirila et al., published in Quality of Life, and on your left hand side is the perceived hyperglycemia score. Look at week 28, significant difference between the two arms. Week 52, significant difference between the two arms. Week 78, week 104, very clear-cut significant difference between the two arms. Significantly lesser hyperglycemia score in the EMPA arm compared to the glimepiride arm. On your right hand side, possibly a more pronounced finding, because hypoglycemia is indeed a noted risk with insulin secretagogues, and of course glimepiride, as we know, is an insulin secretagogue. It's a sulfonylurea, and even at week 8, week 28, week 52, week 78, week 104, everywhere, look at the p-value, look at the statistical significance, significant statistical difference between the two. And if you just look at the visual presentation on your graph, look at how wide the difference is between the two. So significant difference between weeks 28 and 104 as far as hypoglycemia awareness scale is considered when you're comparing your sulfonylurea with empagliflozin. You might call it axiomatic. Essentially, the overall risk of hypoglycemia is as such pretty low in empagliflozin compared to glimepiride, which is a sulfonylurea, a insulin secretagogue. Visceral obesity, waist circumference regarded as the fifth vital sign, and what is the finding from EMPA-REG study? EMPA-REG study, as we know, was a dedicated cardiovascular outcome trial for empagliflozin. And look at the waist circumference over 164 weeks in the versus placebo, versus add-on placebo. In the EMPA arm, reduction by 1.5 centimeter when you are adding 25 or using 25 milligram empagliflozin. The reduction compared to add-on placebo is 1.6 centimeters. Our patient, as we remember, Mr. Naveen, had a waist circumference of 103. So is once again a very good candidate for reduction of the central obesity in such patient. Empagliflozin reduced 24-hour blood pressure in patients with type 2 diabetes and nocturnal uncontrolled hypertension. This is the SACRA study. Now, one thing to note, yes, of course, as we see, clear-cut depiction of reduction in systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, nighttime BP, daytime BP, 24-hour BP, significant reduction in the EMPA arm compared to the placebo arm. But please note that if your patient with diabetes also has hypertension, so of course the patient, apart from the anti-diabetic drug, should be getting the recommended anti-hypertensive drug as well. It's not that your empagliflozin, it's an anti-hypertensive agent. No, it does reduce the BP. As you can see, the daytime BP on the systolic BP reduction is in 2 digits, but double-digit BP reduction. But please note, it's not an anti-hypertensive agent. So if there is a recommendation as a first-line therapy being an ACE inhibitor or ARB, that is the treatment. The second-line add-on therapy would be calcium channel blocker. Third line would be thiazide-like diuretic. The fourth line would be determined by the level of potassium. If it's more than 4.5, of course, alpha blocker or even beta blocker can serve as an option. If the potassium is less than 4.5, then spironolactone becomes an attractive choice. But yes, significant BP reduction. The systolic blood pressure goal achievement in patients with resistant hypertension, type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, empagliflozin used for 12 weeks improved odds of achieving the goal systolic blood pressure by 69%. Yes, the odds ratio is 1.69. Look at the confidence interval, it is 1.33 to 2.15. So it does not include one very significant reduction. Even the visual impression, 37.7% in the EMPA arm compared to the placebo, 26.4. P-value is very significant as well. So significant BP reduction in the EMPA-REG outcome. So moving on from the effect of hypertension, we are moving on to progression of albuminuria. On your left hand side, look at the hazard ratio, it's 1.43. So this is the new onset normoalbuminuria in patients with prior microalbuminuria. So we are talking about patients with microalbuminuria who became normoalbuminuria. So UACR less than 30 would be considered normoalbuminuria, between 30 and 300 would be considered microalbuminuria, and more than 300 to 1 gram would be considered macroalbuminuria. So what we are trying to find out is from how many in the segment 30 to 300 went to less than 30. That hazard ratio is 1.43. So 43% higher likelihood of patients on empagliflozin to shift or improve from microalbuminuria state to normoalbuminuria state. On your right hand side, new onset normo or microalbuminuria in patients with prior macroalbuminuria. So who had an UACR more than 300, how many of them improved to the segment between 30 and 300 or even less than 30? Look at the hazard ratio. Hazard ratio is 1.82. 82% higher likelihood in the EMPA arm compared to the placebo arm. In patients with type 2 diabetes and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, this is the EMPA-REG outcome study, and I mean we have gone on this multiple times. So once again, the hazard ratio is 0.62 when we are considering patients with events of 3P MACE, that is cardiovascular death, non-fatal MI, non-fatal stroke. So hazard ratio is 0.62, 38% relative risk reduction. When we are looking in the Asian patient subgroup, the improvement is even more marked. Here the hazard ratio is 0.44. So 56% is the relative risk reduction when we are considering primary outcome, that is 3P MACE, that is cardiovascular death, non-fatal MI and non-fatal stroke. When we are looking at patients without heart failure burden, even here look at the hazard ratio is 0.63. So the relative risk reduction is 37%. We are talking about cardiovascular death in patients without heart failure. In patients with heart failure, the hazard ratio is 0.67. So 33% relative risk reduction in the empagliflozin arm as far as cardiovascular death in heart failure patients is concerned. The major adverse events, yes, the relative risk is 0.78. So 22% relative risk reduction. For MI, 21% relative risk reduction. For MI or coronary vascularization, including that is PCI or CABG, 20% relative reduction. All the p-values are very significant I mean, we have gone on and on about the EMPA-REG, and this is the data we have. So by treating 6 patients with type 2 diabetes and ASCVD using empagliflozin, one additional hospitalization or death may be prevented in 3 years. This makes it a number needed to treat is 5.4. So absolute risk reduction is 1 by 100 by 5.4. So approximately 16. Absolute risk reduction is approximately 16. 100 patients with coronary artery disease and type 2 diabetes treated with empagliflozin in 3 years, additional non-glycemic benefits. So 9.8 cardiovascular events prevented over 3 years, 8.5 CKD events prevented. We have already looked at how significant reduction from macro to micro or micro to normal albuminuria states is something that we have seen. 5.1 additional SBP goals achieved in resistant hypertension. So yes, it's not an antihypertensive agent, but look at the very high reduction in BP. So even patients with resistant hypertension inadequately controlled with 3 or more drugs are being controlled with the addition of a SGLT2 inhibitor, particularly empagliflozin in this case. These are the cardiovascular outcome trials, very noted trials: EMPA-REG, then CANVAS and DECLARE, TIMI and CREDENCE and VERTIS. Where is CANVAS? Right. And what we find is that if you look at the hazard ratio, only in EMPA-REG, now I am not talking in favor of empagliflozin, not talking against the other SGLT2 inhibitor, but there is data for you from the trials in patients with ASCVD, and I hope you know that both EMPA-REG and VERTIS-CV is with artugliflozin, and these are the only two trials where all the patients had ASCVD. Now in EMPA-REG, the hazard ratio is 0.62, that is overall reduction in CV death is 38%. And look at the confidence interval. But if you look at CANVAS, that is with canagliflozin, or DECLARE TIMI, that is with dapagliflozin, or CREDENCE, that is with canagliflozin, in all that cases, the confidence interval includes 1. So statistically, the reduction in relative risk is not significant. In patients without CVD, in CANVAS, that is with canagliflozin, here also look at the confidence interval, it is 0.6 to 1.43. In DECLARE TIMI for dapagliflozin, CREDENCE for canagliflozin. In none of them, the confidence interval excludes 1. All of them, the confidence interval includes 1. So statistically, it is not significant. So in patients, and we are trying to highlight the comparison between the SGLT2 inhibitor. Of course, there is no head-to-head trial between the different SGLT2 inhibitors. With EMPA-REG, major adverse events, 14% reduction, and we have gone on regarding this. Let us look at the other SGLT2 inhibitors. In CANVAS, CANVAS is for canagliflozin, as we know. Major adverse events reduction, major adverse events 18% reduction, whereas in cardiovascular death, all-cause mortality, we have just seen that the confidence interval includes 1, so it is not significant. Whereas all the components of EMPA-REG showed significant relative risk reduction with empagliflozin, but that is not the case with either of canagliflozin or dapagliflozin or artugliflozin. So EMRISE, also study with empagliflozin, suggests benefits for hospitalization for heart failure and death with empagliflozin versus DPP-4 inhibitor in real world. Even hospitalization to heart failure, the broad category, look at that, 41% relative risk reduction compared to DPP-4 inhibitor. So not only compared to placebo, but even compared to DPP-4 inhibitor. That is exactly why, if you look at guidelines in patients with established ASCVD, SGLT2 inhibitor are the noted agents. Particularly if you consider oral therapy, these are the evidence 1A level drugs, only oral drugs. Of course, the other injectable agents are the GLP-1 agonist. We are not talking about GLP-1 receptor agonist now, but among the oral agent, SGLT2 inhibitors are the agents to use, first line agents with ASCVD risk or CKD. In older patients, more than 65 years of age with type 2 diabetes, EMRISE study suggests decreased risk of death or heart failure with real world use of empagliflozin versus DPP-4 inhibitor. All cause mortality, look at that, 48% reduction in all cause mortality in empagliflozin arm. Look at the hazard ratio. We are looking at the Scandinavian real world evidence. The blue line are the DPP-4 inhibitors, the dotted orange line are the SGLT2 inhibitor. The hazard ratio is 0.42. So 58% lower risk of serious kidney events. 58. That is why even a CKD patient, the oral agents of choice are SGLT2 inhibitors and not DPP-4 inhibitors. So prescription of glucose lowering therapies and risk of COVID-19 mortality in people with type 2 diabetes, a nationwide observational study in England. Now what we see that yes, we have certain difference of opinions, we might say, because obviously although the highest level of evidence would be a meta-analysis or followed by a randomized controlled trial, in COVID times it's realistically not possible to undergo extensive clinical trials pertaining to oral anti-diabetic agents in such patients. What we have would be retrospective studies or database studies or even anecdotal evidence or expert opinions. And what we see, if you look at the confidence interval, look at this. Not very significant difference, is it? With the SGLT2 inhibitor, yes, the adjusted hazard ratio is 0.82. In fact, the confidence interval is significant as well. But sick day rule must be followed, and metformin or sulfonylurea or GLP-1 receptor agonist or SGLT2 inhibitor, ACE inhibitor, ARB, diuretic NSAID should be discontinued during the sick days. And yes, for that very short interim period of sick day, which is the best drug to use? Of course, it's insulin. If your patient is in a terrible mess, don't bother about oral agents for the very short time. Of course, insulin, basal bolus in most cases, or depending on the clinical scenario, it could be a fixed dose infusion as well. But for those sick days, put the patient away from your oral agents. But apart from that, excellent choice in most clinical scenarios, most cardiometabolic issues. This is something that we have kept on referring to. This is ADA Standards of Care 2021. Very similar to your ADA 2020, very similar to ADA 2019. Not only that, very similar to the ADA ESG Consensus Statement 2018, very similar to the ADA ESG Consensus Statement 2019. Very minimal change. At the end of it, if your patient, first line therapy is of course metformin therapy, but followed by that, a severe risk, your oral therapy of choice would be your SGLT2 inhibitor. And of course, can use GLP-1 receptor agonist. Cost is an issue, injectable form of the drug is an issue, but yes, both of them are recommended. If heart failure risk, particularly the heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, LVF less than 45%, once again, SGLT2 inhibitor with proven benefit of the population. We have looked at EMPA-REG, we have looked at EMPRISE, we have looked at EMPEROR, very clear-cut data pertaining to heart failure, improvement in the cardiac mortality with empagliflozin as well. CKD risk, once again, we have looked at data, very significant reduction in macroalbuminuria and conversion into microalbuminuria cohort. So reduction in the progression of CKD as well. Compelling need to minimize hypoglycemia. Once again, DP4 inhibitor, GLP-1 receptor agonist, SGLT2 inhibitor, and thiazolidine are choices that you can have. Hypoglycemia risk, as we have already discussed, is significantly low in the SGLT2 inhibitor group of particularly empagliflozin, as we have discussed when we have compared in the DeFlorenzo study, comparing empagliflozin with sulfonylurea like glimepiride. Compelling need to minimize weight. Weight reduction. Only oral agent with an established weight reduction portfolio would be your SGLT2 inhibitor. Yes, there is some data to show that metformin and DP4 inhibitors also reduce weight, but we have adequate evidence to now consider them as weight neutral agent. Both metformin and DP4 inhibitor are weight neutral agent, and the only oral agent with weight reduction, significant weight reduction, would be the SGLT2 inhibitor. Of course, GLP-1 receptor agonists are noted agents for weight reduction as well, but yes, they are injectable agents. Pretty much a synopsis of what we have discussed about the role of metformin as a first line, followed by the different places where SGLT2 inhibition has a role to play. But our main target of discussion was the role of combination of metformin and SGLT2 inhibitor in early diabetes and how that helps. We have looked at data pertaining to that. We have come to the end of our discussion. Thank you so much. We are now open to take questions.